The moment you realize that lack is not your identity, everything begins to shift. You were never created to live trapped by shortage, anxiety, unpaid bills, or silent fear about tomorrow. You were created to walk under an open heaven, sustained by a God whose resources do not belong to the visible world. What you see in your bank account is not the final authority over your life. What you see in your circumstance is not the limit of your destiny. There is a realm that cannot be touched by inflation, recession, rejection, or human delay. And when prayer connects you to that unseen realm, provision begins to flow in ways logic cannot explain. Many people pray from desperation, but few pray from revelation. Desperation begs. Revelation aligns. Desperation says, God, I don't have enough. Revelation declares, God, you are more than enough and I am connected to you. The prayer that brings money from unseen sources is not a magical sentence. It is a posture of faith that understands where supply truly comes from. When your spirit agrees with heaven instead of fear, doors begin to open that no human could have planned. When you truly understand that your source is not visible systems, but God himself, your entire relationship with money, security, and future begins to change at the deepest level. Most people unconsciously tie their sense of safety to what they can see and control: a paycheck, a business contract, a savings account, a client list, or the stability of the economy. While these things are useful and necessary channels, they were never designed to be the foundation of your confidence. The danger comes when the channel becomes your source in your mind. The moment a channel shakes, fear rises, panic follows, and peace disappears. This happens because the heart was leaning on something temporary instead of something eternal. When you shift your understanding and allow God to become your true provider in your thinking, emotions, and expectations, something powerful happens inside you. Fear loosens its grip, pressure lifts, and faith becomes natural rather than forced. God's nature has always been that of a provider. From the beginning, creation itself reveals a God who supplies before there is demand. Light existed before human eyes could see. Fruit trees existed before hunger existed. Water flowed before thirst was felt. Provision was built into the design of life. This means lack was never God's intention for humanity. Dependence was. Dependence is not weakness, it is alignment. When you depend on the source rather than the system, you live from trust instead of tension. Systems can collapse, markets can fluctuate, jobs can end, people can disappoint, but God remains unchanged, unlimited, and faithful. He does not draw from one economy. He governs all economies. Many people struggle financially not because God is withholding, but because their mindset is limited to visible pathways. If money can only come through one employer, one customer, one opportunity, or one method in your thinking, then your expectation becomes small and fragile. But when your faith expands to acknowledge that God can move through countless unseen channels, hope becomes resilient. A door closing no longer feels like disaster. It becomes a redirection. A delay no longer feels like punishment. It becomes preparation. When God is your source, you stop begging people for security and start trusting divine orchestration. Fear is the loudest voice when systems become the source. Fear says, what if this ends? What if this fails? What if I don't have enough? Fear creates emotional pressure that clouds judgment and weakens spiritual sensitivity. But when God is your source, peace becomes your anchor. Peace does not mean there are no challenges. It means challenges no longer control your inner world. You begin to sleep better. You make decisions with clarity instead of panic. You stop chasing money and start stewarding purpose. Peace itself becomes a sign that your trust is properly positioned. Understanding God as your source also transforms how you pray. Instead of praying from desperation, you pray from relationship. Instead of treating God like a last option when resources fail, you treat him as the first foundation of every plan. Your prayers become conversations of trust rather than emotional survival. Faith rises naturally when your heart truly believes that provision flows from divine care rather than human struggle. This shift also protects you from unhealthy dependence on people. When people are your source, disappointment becomes inevitable. You attach emotional weight to their approval, decisions, and generosity. You may compromise values, tolerate mistreatment, or live in fear of rejection because your sense of provision feels threatened. But when God is your source, people become partners, not pressure points. You can honor relationships without worshiping them. You can appreciate opportunities without being enslaved by them. You remain grateful but not dependent. When God is your source, generosity becomes easier. You no longer give from fear of losing, but from confidence of replenishment. You understand that what flows out of your hands does not disappear. It moves within divine circulation. This mindset breaks the spirit of scarcity that traps many people in constant anxiety. Scarcity says, hold tight or you will run out. Faith says, release and trust the source to refill. Another powerful effect of recognizing God as your source is resilience during uncertainty. Economic shifts, business challenges, health crises, and global instability no longer define your destiny. You remain steady because your foundation is not tied to temporary systems. You become adaptable instead of fearful, creative instead of stressed, hopeful instead of defeated. You begin to expect solutions instead of disasters. Your mindset becomes solution-oriented because you trust a God who specializes in impossible situations. When this truth becomes deeply rooted in your heart, gratitude flows naturally. You stop measuring your worth by numbers and start measuring your life by alignment. You become thankful not only for what you have, but for who you trust. Gratitude protects your peace and keeps your faith strong during waiting seasons. You understand that even unseen provision is still provision in progress. Seeing God as your source also reshapes your identity. You no longer see yourself as a struggler trying to survive in a harsh world. You begin to see yourself as a steward entrusted with divine flow. Your confidence rises not from pride, but from assurance. You walk differently, speak differently, plan differently, and dream differently because your security is no longer fragile. The greatest freedom this revelation brings is emotional stability. Money no longer defines your mood. Circumstances no longer dictate your confidence. Delays no longer steal your joy. You remain anchored because your trust is anchored in something eternal. When God becomes your source, your life shifts from survival mode into purpose mode. This is why the first and most important keynote is understanding that your source is not visible systems. God is your provider. Everything else in faith flows from this foundation. Prayer becomes powerful. Generosity becomes joyful. Patience becomes possible. Obedience becomes natural. And peace becomes constant. When the source is right, the flow will always follow. When prayer is understood only as asking for help, it becomes shallow, emotional, and inconsistent. Many people approach prayer like an emergency button they press only when pressure rises, bills stack up, or fear overwhelms them. In those moments, the focus is often centered on the problem rather than on alignment with God's heart. But the truth is that real prayer is not merely a request line to heaven. It is a spiritual connection that aligns your inner world with the unseen realm where true authority, wisdom, and provision originate. When alignment happens first, needs are met as a natural outcome rather than a desperate chase. Alignment means your thoughts begin to agree with God's promises instead of your circumstances. Your emotions begin to rest in trust instead of panic. Your decisions begin to flow from faith instead of fear. Prayer reshapes perception before it changes situations. It reorders priorities, purifies motives, strengthens patience, and stabilizes identity. When your spirit aligns with heaven, you stop reacting to life and start responding with clarity and confidence. You no longer feel controlled by what is happening around you because anger is governing what is happening within you. But the unseen realm operates by divine order, not emotional urgency. When prayer brings alignment, it positions you within that order. Many people ask God to bless what they are doing instead of asking God what they should be doing. Alignment reverses that pattern. It allows God's wisdom to guide your direction rather than your own pressure. When direction comes from alignment, energy is focused instead of scattered. Confusion decreases, peace increases, progress becomes steady instead of chaotic. Bob Beer also aligns your expectations. Without alignment, people expect provision to come only through familiar methods. They limit God unconsciously by their own past experiences. But when prayer opens spiritual awareness, expectation expands beyond the visible. You begin to recognize that God can move through ideas, timing, relationships, creativity, favor, protection, and unseen orchestration. You stop boxing God into human patterns and allow divine possibilities to reshape your thinking. This expansion of expectation is often the gateway to unexpected provision. Alignment through prayer strengthens spiritual sensitivity. When noise settles, clarity rises. The mind becomes calmer. The heart becomes receptive. Subtle guidance becomes noticeable. Sometimes the answer to prayer is not a sudden miracle, but a quiet instruction, a gentle redirection, or a new perspective that shifts everything. When alignment is present, you learn to recognize these signals instead of ignoring them. You become more attentive to divine timing and less controlled by emotional urgency. Another powerful effect of alignment is purification of motive. When people pursue money purely for security, status, or control, anxiety multiplies because those goals can never fully satisfy the soul. Alignment redirects desire toward purpose, impact, stewardship, and obedience. Money becomes a tool rather than a master. This inner correction protects you from greed, comparison, and unhealthy pressure. When motives align with God's heart, provision flows with peace instead of tension. Prayer also aligns your language. What you consistently speak shapes what you consistently believe. When alignment deepens, negative confession weakens. Fear-based language loses influence. Faith-filled language becomes natural. You begin to speak hope, gratitude, expectation, and confidence, even when circumstances remain challenging. This does not mean denial of reality. It means agreement with a higher reality. Your words become bridges that connect spiritual truth with physical experience. Alignment protects you from spiritual exhaustion. When life is driven by self-effort alone, burnout becomes inevitable. Pressure increases because everything depends on human strength. But when prayer keeps alignment active, divine strength supports human effort. You work with peace rather than pressure. You rest with confidence rather than guilt. You trust the process rather than forcing outcomes. Alignment produces sustainability, not just temporary success. One of the greatest benefits of prayer alignment is emotional stability. Anxiety decreases because control is surrendered. Frustration decreases because expectations are surrendered. Comparison decreases because identity is secured. When your inner world becomes ordered, external chaos loses its ability to disturb your peace. This emotional stability strengthens discernment and decision-making. You become less reactive and more intentional. Alignment also strengthens patience. When you trust divine timing, waiting becomes purposeful rather than painful. You understand that unseen processes often require time to mature. Just as seeds grow underground before breaking through soil, divine provision often develops invisibly before manifestation. Alignment keeps faith alive during silence. It prevents premature decisions that could damage long-term outcomes. When prayer becomes alignment rather than desperation, your relationship with God deepens, trust grows stronger, communication becomes clearer, dependency becomes healthy rather than fearful. You no longer approach God only when you need something. You remain connected daily. This consistency builds spiritual confidence and sensitivity over time. Alignment transforms how you handle setbacks. Instead of interpreting delay as rejection or failure, you begin to see it as redirection, protection, or preparation. This perspective keeps hope intact during difficult seasons. It prevents discouragement from poisoning faith. You stay emotionally steady even when progress seems slow. The unseen realm responds to alignment because order attracts flow. When your inner world is ordered by trust, obedience, gratitude, and faith, divine resources move more freely into your life. Confusion blocks clarity. Fear blocks sensitivity. Pride blocks guidance. Alignment removes these blockages gradually and naturally. Ultimately, prayer that aligns you with the unseen realm reshapes your entire life direction. It refines vision, strengthens discipline, deepens character, increases wisdom, and prepares you to steward what you receive responsibly. Provision becomes a result of alignment rather than a pursuit driven by stress. When alignment becomes your priority, peace becomes your companion. Clarity becomes your guide, patience becomes your strength, and faith becomes your foundation. Needs no longer dominate your prayers. Purpose does, and when purpose leads, provision follows naturally, often from sources you never could have predicted. Faith is not a feeling, a mood, or a moment of emotional excitement. Faith is a spiritual posture that determines what you allow to govern your inner world and your decisions. When faith is active, it opens access to realities that cannot be touched, measured, or seen with natural eyes. The unseen realm responds to faith because faith speaks the language of heaven. Fear speaks the language of limitation. Whatever language you consistently speak is the realm you consistently live from. When fear dominates, possibilities shrink, confidence weakens, and hope fades. But when faith governs your heart, supernatural provision becomes accessible because your spirit is aligned with divine authority rather than human restriction. Fear is subtle. It does not always appear as panic or anxiety. Sometimes it appears as overthinking, excessive caution, constant worry, hesitation, procrastination, and negative expectation. Fear quietly convinces the mind to prepare for loss rather than victory. It trains the heart to expect disappointment rather than breakthrough. Over time, fear becomes a habit of thought, shaping decisions without awareness. This is why many people unknowingly block the divine flow, not because God is unwilling, but because fear has closed their spiritual sensitivity and weakened their expectation. Faith functions differently. Faith expects solutions before problems resolve. Faith speaks gratitude before evidence appears. Faith acts with obedience even when outcomes are uncertain. Faith is not blind optimism. It is spiritual confidence rooted in trust of God's character. When faith is active, it releases peace that stabilizes the mind and emotions. This peace is not passive, it is powerful. It clears mental noise, sharpens discernment, and strengthens patience. Peace itself becomes a sign that faith is functioning correctly. Supernatural provision requires spiritual agreement. Heaven does not force blessings upon resistant hearts. Faith creates cooperation between divine will and human receptivity. When faith is present, prayer becomes effective because the heart truly believes what the mouth is speaking. When faith is absent, prayer becomes mechanical, repetitive, and emotionally strained. Faith gives prayer authority, not volume. Faith does not need to shout. It simply stands firm in trust. Faith also shapes language. What you speak consistently becomes what you expect unconsciously. Fear-based language reinforces limitation. I can't, it's impossible, nothing ever works, I will always struggle. These statements form invisible boundaries around potential. Faith-based language releases authority. God is able, provision is coming, I am guided, doors are opening, I trust divine timing. Words do not manipulate reality, they align perception with spiritual truth. When perception aligns correctly, decisions improve, rage strengthens, and opportunities become visible. Faith activates movement. When faith is present, small actions carry great power. A phone call, an application, a conversation, a creative idea, or a step of obedience can become the doorway to unexpected provision. Fear hesitates, faith moves. Even when the step seems insignificant, obedience multiplies impact because divine favor accompanies faith-driven action. Many breakthroughs begin with simple steps that only faith would dare to take. Another powerful dimension of faith is patience. Faith does not rush divine processes. It trusts timing without anxiety. Fear pressures urgency and impulsive decisions. Faith allows growth to unfold naturally. Seeds do not sprout overnight. Foundations are built before buildings rise. Faith respects preparation. This patience protects long-term stability rather than temporary success. Faith understands that what arrives too early can collapse easily. Faith strengthens resilience. Delays, setbacks, and disappointments do not destroy faith. They refine it. When faith is genuine, challenges deepen trust rather than weaken it. Fear collapses under pressure. Faith adapts and grows stronger. This resilience allows you to remain hopeful even when visible progress is slow. Hope anchored in faith prevents emotional burnout and discouragement. Faith also breaks dependency on human validation. When faith is active, your confidence is rooted in divine approval rather than external affirmation. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes, numbers, or opinions. This emotional freedom allows you to take risks, explore opportunities, and remain creative without fear of failure. Confidence becomes stable rather than fragile. One of the most powerful effects of faith is clarity. Fear clouds judgment. Faith sharpens discernment. When fear dominates, choices become reactive and defensive. When faith leads, decisions become intentional and peaceful. You begin to sense what aligns with your purpose and what distracts from it. This clarity saves time, energy, and emotional strain. Faith also releases gratitude. When you trust that God is working, even when you cannot see it, thankfulness flows naturally. Gratitude strengthens faith further, creating a cycle of expectation and peace. Complaining weakens faith. Thankfulness amplifies trust. This spiritual rhythm keeps the heart sensitive to divine movement. Supernatural provision is not random. It flows through spiritual order. Faith aligns you with that order. When faith governs your mindset, actions, and speech, you become positioned to receive what God desires to release. Fear cannot coexist comfortably with faith. One must decrease for the other to grow. Every time you choose trust over worry, obedience over hesitation, gratitude over complaint, faith strengthens and fear weakens. Faith does not deny reality. It interprets reality through divine truth. It acknowledges challenges but refuses to let them define the future. It sees beyond the visible into the invisible promises of God. This perspective empowers endurance and confidence. When faith becomes your default posture, your entire atmosphere changes. Peace becomes consistent. Expectation becomes healthy. Decisions become steady. Opportunities become noticeable. Provision becomes accessible. You stop chasing miracles and start walking in alignment with them. Ultimately, faith activates supernatural provision because it creates cooperation between heaven and earth. It opens spiritual access, sharpens sensitivity, strengthens obedience, stabilizes emotions, and aligns identity. Fear closes doors. Faith opens pathways. What you consistently believe shapes what you consistently experience. When faith governs your life, unseen provision begins to manifest naturally, often in ways beyond human explanation. Gratitude is not merely good manners or positive thinking. It is a spiritual declaration that reshapes perception, strengthens faith, and unlocks divine flow. When you give thanks before you see results, you are announcing that you trust God's nature more than your present evidence. This posture moves your heart out of survival mode and into expectancy. Many people wait to feel grateful after the breakthrough arrives, but spiritual maturity learns to give thanks while the seed is still underground. Gratitude before manifestation is a sign of deep trust, and trust creates spiritual alignment that allows increase to flow naturally. A grateful heart shifts focus away from what is missing and anchors attention on what is already working. When attention remains locked on lack, fear grows, pressure intensifies, and hope weakens. But when attention shifts toward gratitude, the mind becomes calmer, emotions stabilize, and perspective widens. Gratitude retrains the brain to recognize provision rather than deficiency. This shift may seem small, but it creates powerful momentum over time. What you consistently notice becomes what you consistently multiply in your awareness. Gratitude also protects peace. Anxiety thrives in environments of complaint, comparison, and constant dissatisfaction. When gratitude becomes habitual, peace increases because the heart rests in appreciation rather than expectation pressure. Peace is not passive. It stabilizes decision-making, strengthens patience, and protects emotional health. A peaceful mind is more receptive to divine guidance than a stressed one. When gratitude guards your peace, clarity becomes easier to access. Thanksgiving strengthens faith because it reinforces memory of God's consistency. Every expression of gratitude reminds the soul of past faithfulness. Memory fuels confidence. When you remember what God has already done, you naturally expect Him to continue working. Gratitude turns testimonies into fuel for future trust. This inner confidence reduces fear and strengthens spiritual expectation. Gratitude also purifies motive. When people chase provision purely for comfort, status, or control, they often remain restless even after receiving. Gratitude redirects desire toward appreciation rather than accumulation. Contentment grows. Greed weakens. Comparison loses influence. A thankful heart is harder to manipulate by pressure or insecurity. It remains stable and grounded. Another powerful effect of gratitude is that it increases sensitivity to opportunity. When the mind is thankful, it becomes observant rather than distracted. You notice open doors, helpful conversations, creative ideas, and timely connections more easily. Gratitude sharpens awareness. Complaining dulls awareness. What you appreciate becomes more visible. What you criticize becomes heavy and draining. Gratitude also shifts how prayer functions. Instead of approaching God with angst, thank you, or entitlement, you approach with humility and trust. Prayer becomes relational rather than transactional. You are not merely requesting. You are acknowledging partnership and care. This relational posture deepens intimacy and strengthens confidence that provision is already unfolding. When gratitude becomes consistent, patience strengthens. Waiting seasons become less painful because the heart remains nourished by appreciation rather than frustration. You stop measuring time emotionally and start trusting divine timing. Gratitude reminds you that progress is still happening even when visible evidence seems slow. Gratitude protects against bitterness and disappointment. When expectations are delayed or outcomes differ from plans, disappointment can harden the heart. Gratitude keeps the heart soft and flexible. It allows learning rather than resentment. It preserves hope rather than cynicism. A grateful heart recovers faster from setbacks because it refuses to dwell in negativity. Thanksgiving also multiplies joy. Joy is not dependent on circumstances. It flows from internal perspective. Gratitude trains the heart to celebrate small victories, quiet blessings, daily provision, and unseen protection. Joy strengthens endurance. A joyful heart remains motivated, hopeful, and resilient during long journeys. Gratitude reshapes identity. Instead of seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances, you begin to see yourself as a recipient of divine care. This identity shift increases confidence and emotional security. You stop defining your worth by what you lack and start defining it by what you are stewarding. Stewardship replaces survival thinking. When gratitude becomes habitual, generosity becomes easier. A thankful heart recognizes abundance even in simplicity. It releases freely because it trusts replenishment. Scarcity loses its grip. Fear weakens. Giving becomes joyful rather than stressful. Gratitude fuels trust in divine circulation. Thanksgiving also aligns you with divine order. The unseen realm responds to trust and appreciation because both reflect faith in God's character. Complaining creates resistance. Gratitude creates openness. It is not manipulation. It is alignment. When the heart aligns with trust, flow becomes natural. Gratitude strengthens emotional discipline. Instead of reacting impulsively to pressure, you respond thoughtfully. You become less controlled by mood and more guided by perspective. This emotional maturity protects relationships, finances, and long-term decisions. Gratitude also increases humility. It reminds you that provision is not self-generated. Pride weakens dependence on God. Gratitude reinforces dependence in a healthy way. Humility keeps the heart teachable, flexible, and sensitive to guidance. When gratitude precedes manifestation, it becomes a prophetic declaration of faith. You are essentially saying that you trust the process even before you see the product. This posture strengthens spiritual confidence and keeps your heart aligned with hope rather than pressure. Over time, gratitude becomes a lifestyle rather than a moment. Your language changes, your outlook softens, your expectations stabilize, your stress decreases, your peace deepens, your awareness sharpens, your faith strengthens. Gratitude does not ignore challenges. It places them in proper perspective. It acknowledges difficulty without allowing difficulty to dominate identity or hope. This balance creates emotional strength and spiritual maturity. Ultimately, gratitude unlocks increase because it prepares the heart to steward abundance responsibly. It keeps you grounded, peaceful, generous, patient, and faithful. A grateful heart remains fertile soil for divine flow. When thanksgiving becomes your default posture, provision no longer feels forced or stressful. It flows naturally in alignment with trust, purpose, and peace. Obedience is one of the most powerful spiritual keys that unlocks unseen provision because it positions your life within divine order. Many people pray passionately for breakthroughs, but quietly resist the instructions that follow. They want the blessing without the discipline, the harvest without the planting, the miracle without the movement. Provision often travels along the pathway of obedience. When you respond to God's guidance, even in small and simple ways, you activate doors that cannot be opened through effort alone. Obedience requires trust. It means stepping forward without having full clarity of the outcome. The mind naturally wants guarantees, security, and visible confirmation before acting. But faith operates differently. Faith obeys because it trusts the one giving direction. When you obey without needing to control every detail, you demonstrate spiritual maturity. This trust invites divine involvement into your decisions and circumstances. Sometimes obedience feels uncomfortable because it stretches familiar patterns. It may require letting go of old habits, unhealthy relationships, limiting beliefs, or familiar comfort zones. It may push to forgive when pride wants to resist, to start when fear wants to delay, or to release when scarcity wants to hold tight. Growth always requires movement beyond what feels safe. Obedience is the bridge between where you are and where God intends to take you. Many divine breakthroughs begin with simple acts that seem insignificant at first. A phone call, an application, a conversation, a skill upgrade, a new habit, a change in routine, a generous gesture, a decision to forgive, a step of discipline. These actions may appear ordinary, but when guided by divine instruction, they carry supernatural impact. Obedience activates spiritual momentum. Small steps accumulate into major transformation. Obedience also sharpens spiritual sensitivity. The more you respond to guidance, the clearer that guidance becomes over time. Trust grows through practice. When you ignore promptings repeatedly, sensitivity dulls. But when you act faithfully on what you sense, clarity strengthens. This ongoing sensitivity allows you to recognize opportunities that others overlook. Divine strategy often appears subtle, not dramatic. Obedience trains you to recognize and respond to these subtle openings. Another powerful dimension of obedience is protection. Sometimes God's instruction is not only about increase, but also about avoidance. He may redirect you away from decisions, relationships, or investments that could bring future loss. What feels like delay or restriction today may be shielding you from unnecessary pain tomorrow. Obedience keeps you aligned with divine protection as well as provision. Obedience strengthens discipline. Discipline creates stability. Stability creates consistency. Consistency creates growth. When you consistently obey wise instruction, your habits improve, your stewardship strengthens, and your confidence increases. Over time, this disciplined alignment attracts greater responsibility and greater trust from God. Faithfulness in small things prepares you for larger assignments. Obedience also humbles the ego. It teaches surrender of control and pride. The desire to always be right, to dominate outcomes, or to prove self-sufficiency weakens spiritual flow. Obedience keeps the heart teachable and flexible. A teachable heart grows faster than a stubborn one. Growth multiplies opportunities. Sometimes obedience requires patience. The results of obedience may not appear immediately. Seeds take time to grow. Foundations must settle before structures rise. Obedience trusts the process rather than demanding instant results. This patience protects long-term fruit rather than short-term excitement. Obedience also releases peace. When you know you're walking in alignment, anxiety decreases. Even if outcomes remain uncertain, the heart rests because conscience is clear. Peace strengthens resilience and clarity. A peaceful mind makes better decisions than a pressured one. Another aspect of obedience is courage. Obedience often asks you to move before fear disappears. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement despite fear. Each obedient step weakens fear's authority and strengthens confidence. Over time, fear loses its grip because experience confirms God's faithfulness. Obedience also positions you for divine favor. Favor flows where alignment exists. When your choices reflect trust and humility, doors begin to open naturally. People are drawn to integrity. Opportunities align unexpectedly. Timing synchronizes in surprising ways. These are not coincidences. They are the fruit of spiritual alignment. Obedience reshapes identity. You stop seeing yourself as passive or powerless and begin seeing yourself as responsive and trusted. Confidence increases because you recognize that your life has direction and purpose. Purpose strengthens motivation and endurance. When obedience becomes habitual, procrastination weakens, excuses lose influence, discipline strengthens, momentum builds, life becomes more intentional rather than reactive, progress accelerates, obedience also deepens relationship with God, trust grows through experience, communication becomes clearer, dependence becomes healthy rather than fearful. This relational depth strengthens spiritual confidence and stability. Sometimes obedience will challenge logic. Divine instruction may not always align with immediate understanding. This is where humility protects faith. Trusting beyond logic expands spiritual maturity. It stretches capacity for miracles. Obedience prepares you for stewardship. Provision without discipline often leads to misuse or loss. Obedience develops responsibility before increase arrives. Character matures before capacity expands. This order protects long-term success. Obedience also strengthens gratitude. When you see how small acts produce meaningful outcomes, appreciation deepens. Faith becomes experiential rather than theoretical. Confidence becomes grounded rather than emotional. Obedience is not perfection. It is responsiveness. You will not always execute perfectly, but consistent willingness keeps alignment intact. Grace supports growth. Ultimately, obedience creates pathways for unseen supply because it connects your actions with divine wisdom. It activates spiritual flow through daily decisions. It opens doors that effort alone cannot unlock. It protects from unnecessary loss. It builds character, discipline, peace, and confidence. When you choose obedience, you are choosing trust over fear, movement over stagnation, alignment over resistance, growth over comfort. And when alignment becomes consistent, provision follows naturally, often through channels you never anticipated. Generosity breaks the grip of scarcity because it rewires how the heart relates to provision, control, and trust. Scarcity is not merely a financial condition. It is a mindset that constantly fears loss, anticipates shortage, and tightens its grip on resources. Even people who have much can live with a scarcity mentality, always anxious, never satisfied, and emotionally pressured. Generosity confronts this mindset directly by teaching the heart to trust the flow rather than cling to accumulation. When you release willingly, you declare that your security does not come from what you hold, but from the source that supplies. The natural mind resists generosity during times of uncertainty because logic says to preserve, protect, and minimize risk. But the spiritual principle operates differently. Release creates circulation. What circulates multiplies. What stagnates decays. When resources remain trapped by fear, growth slows. When resources move freely through faith, momentum increases. Generosity keeps the flow active, both spiritually and practically. Generosity also reshapes identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone constantly trying to survive, you begin to see yourself as someone entrusted with abundance to steward and distribute wisely. This identity shift builds confidence and responsibility. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can keep and start measuring impact by how much value you create and release. This mindset aligns naturally with divine purpose. Giving strengthens trust. Every act of generosity becomes a practical declaration of faith. You are essentially saying that you trust God's ability to replenish more than you trust your ability to control outcomes. Each act weakens fear and strengthens spiritual confidence. Over time, generosity becomes easier, joyful, and natural rather than stressful or forced. Generosity also trains the heart to recognize abundance rather than lack. When you give, you become aware of what you already possess. Appreciation increases. Gratitude strengthens. Complaining weakens. Your perception shifts from deficiency to sufficiency. This shift improves emotional stability and decision-making. A grateful heart remains calm and optimistic even in uncertain seasons. Another powerful effect of generosity is that it improves relationships. Giving builds trust, connection, goodwill, and influence. People are naturally drawn to generosity because it reflects care, reliability, and integrity. Healthy relationships often create opportunities, collaboration, favor, and growth. Generosity plants relational seeds that often produce unexpected harvests later. Generosity also increases humility. It reminds the heart that provision is not self-generated. Pride weakens dependence on God. Humility strengthens spiritual sensitivity and gratitude. When you give, you acknowledge partnership with divine supply rather than personal ownership. This humility keeps the heart teachable and grounded. Giving breaks emotional attachment to money. When money controls the heart, anxiety grows. When the heart controls money, peace grows. Generosity keeps money in its proper role as a tool rather than a master. Freedom increases when attachment decreases. This emotional freedom allows wiser financial decisions and healthier priorities. Generosity sharpens discernment. When you give intentionally, you become more aware of stewardship. You evaluate spending, saving, and investing with clarity rather than impulse. Discipline strengthens. Responsibility increases. Long-term planning improves. Generosity does not promote recklessness. It promotes wise circulation. Giving also activates joy. Joy grows when your resources contribute to impact beyond yourself. Purpose increases satisfaction more than possession, meaning strengthens motivation. When generosity becomes part of your lifestyle, fulfillment deepens. Generosity strengthens patience. You learn to trust timing rather than demand immediate return. Seeds take time to grow. Faith respects the process. This patience reduces anxiety and impulsive decisions. Giving also develops emotional maturity. You learn to manage attachment, disappointment, expectation, and trust. This maturity strengthens relationships and stability. Generosity multiplies influence. People trust generous leaders, partners, and contributors. Influence creates opportunities for growth, collaboration, and expansion. Influence itself becomes a form of provision. Generosity aligns with divine order. The unseen realm responds to circulation because it reflects trust in God's abundance rather than fear-based control. Alignment creates flow. Resistance creates stagnation. Generosity also protects against greed and comparison. When you give freely, competition weakens, contentment strengthens, peace increases, comparison loses power, giving improves self-respect. You recognize your ability to contribute positively rather than merely consume. Contribution builds dignity and confidence. Generosity also increases spiritual sensitivity. You become more aware of needs around you, divine promptings, and opportunities to serve. This awareness strengthens purpose and direction. Generosity strengthens community. Strong communities create shared support, opportunity, and resilience. Collective generosity multiplies impact. Generosity invites divine trust. When you steward resources faithfully, greater responsibility becomes possible. Faithfulness attracts expansion. Giving also reinforces gratitude. Appreciation grows as you witness impact. Gratitude strengthens peace and hope. Generosity is not about amount, it is about heart posture. Small acts done consistently cultivate powerful mindset shifts. Over time, generosity transforms scarcity thinking into abundance thinking. Fear loses authority, trust strengthens, peace increases, confidence stabilizes. When generosity becomes natural, money no longer controls emotional stability. You become flexible, calm, and optimistic. Provision becomes less stressful and more purposeful. Ultimately, generosity breaks the spirit of scarcity because it retrains the heart to trust divine flow rather than human control. L. It aligns identity with stewardship rather than survival. It opens relational and spiritual pathways for increase. It strengthens faith, humility, gratitude, joy, and peace. When you release willingly, you position yourself within divine circulation where unseen supply moves freely. And as flow increases, fear decreases, stability strengthens, and abundance becomes a lifestyle rather than a struggle. Patience protects the miracle because divine growth often happens invisibly before it becomes visible. The natural mind prefers speed, instant results, and immediate confirmation, but spiritual processes operate according to preparation, timing, and maturity. Just as a seed must first develop roots beneath the soil before it breaks the surface, many breakthroughs form quietly within unseen systems long before they manifest outwardly. When patience is absent, people often abandon what is still developing, mistaking silence for failure. Patience allows faith to remain steady while unseen progress continues. Waiting seasons test the heart more than the circumstances. They reveal trust, discipline, emotional maturity, and perspective. Impatience often pushes people into premature decisions that create unnecessary complications. Rushing ahead of timing can damage foundations that were meant to support long-term stability. Patience protects you from shortcuts that may deliver temporary relief, but long-term strain. True growth requires time to settle, strengthen, and stabilize. Patience strengthens trust. When you wait without losing peace, you demonstrate confidence in divine order rather than personal control. Trust deepens as you learn to rest in timing rather than manipulate outcomes. This inner stability allows clarity to increase instead of anxiety. A patient heart remains sensitive to guidance rather than driven by emotional urgency. Waiting also refines character. During silent seasons, pride softens, humility deepens, discipline strengthens, and perseverance grows. These internal developments prepare you to steward future provision wisely. Without character growth, sudden increase can become destructive rather than beneficial. Patience builds capacity before expansion arrives. Patience teaches emotional regulation. Instead of reacting impulsively to pressure, you learn to respond thoughtfully. Emotional maturity strengthens decision-making and relational stability. Many mistakes are made not because of lack of intelligence, but because of impatience-driven reactions. Patience protects clarity. Patience also strengthens resilience. Delays and obstacles do not break hope, they strengthen endurance. Resilient faith remains steady even when visible progress slows. Hope anchored in patience prevents burnout and discouragement. You learn to trust progress that cannot yet be measured. Waiting seasons sharpen spiritual sensitivity. When noise decreases, listening increases, distractions fade, awareness deepens, subtle guidance becomes noticeable. Patience creates space for discernment and wisdom. Many divine instructions are quiet and easily missed by rushed minds. Patience also strengthens gratitude. When you learn to appreciate the journey rather than only the destination, joy becomes sustainable. Gratitude nourishes the heart during long processes. This gratitude protects peace and keeps faith energized. Patience prevents comparison. When you trust your own timing, you stop measuring your progress against others. Comparison creates dissatisfaction and unnecessary pressure. Patience keeps focus on personal growth rather than external validation. Patience aligns expectations with reality. Unrealistic timelines often produce disappointment. When patience governs expectation, satisfaction increases because progress is measured accurately. You learn to celebrate incremental growth rather than waiting only for massive breakthroughs. Patience also deepens humility. It teaches surrender of control and acceptance of divine wisdom. Humility keeps the heart teachable and flexible. A teachable heart adapts faster and grows stronger. Waiting seasons also cultivate creativity. When forced to slow down, the mind explores new ideas, perspectives, and strategies. Innovation often emerges during quiet seasons. Patience allows insight to mature rather than forcing shallow solutions. Patience protects relationships. Impulsive decisions often damage trust and stability. Patience encourages communication, understanding, and wisdom in relational choices. Healthy relationships support long-term success and emotional health. Patience strengthens consistency. You learn to remain faithful in daily disciplines even when results are slow. Consistency builds momentum gradually. Momentum compounds over time. Patience guards against discouragement. Discouragement grows when expectations outrun reality. Patience recalibrates perspective and preserves hope. Hope fuels endurance. Patience also builds spiritual confidence. Each season of waiting that ends in fulfillment strengthens trust in divine timing. Experience reinforces faith. Patience strengthens identity. You stop defining yourself by immediate outcomes and start anchoring identity in growth and alignment. This stability reduces emotional volatility. Patience also protects against greed. Impatience often seeks shortcuts, quick gains, or unhealthy risks. Patience respects sustainability and long-term stability. Patience develops wisdom. Wisdom requires observation, reflection, and experience. Quick decisions rarely produce deep wisdom. Patience allows lessons to mature. Patience teaches surrender. Control decreases. Trust increases. Peace stabilizes. This surrender deepens spiritual intimacy. Patience protects the miracle because it allows full development before exposure. Immature blessings can collapse under pressure. Prepared blessings endure. Patience also increases appreciation. What takes time to build carries deeper value and respect. Gratitude increases. Patience trains the heart to remain hopeful during uncertainty. This emotional strength prevents burnout. Patience aligns you with divine rhythm rather than human urgency. Divine rhythm produces sustainable fruit. When patience governs your mindset, pressure weakens, clarity strengthens, faith stabilizes, and peace deepens. You stop forcing doors and start trusting preparation. You remain steady when progress feels slow because you understand that unseen growth is still growth. Ultimately, patience safeguards what faith has planted. It allows divine processes to mature fully. It prevents premature collapse. It strengthens character, clarity, resilience, gratitude, humility, and wisdom. Patience does not delay destiny. It prepares you to carry it well. When Chitty shifts from struggle to stewardship, the entire direction of life begins to change. Many people unknowingly carry a survival mindset shaped by past limitations, disappointments, or fear. This mindset constantly asks, how do I get by? Instead of how do I build responsibly? Survival thinking focuses on immediate relief rather than long-term growth. It reacts to pressure instead of responding with wisdom. But when identity transforms into stewardship, the heart recognizes responsibility, purpose, and partnership with God. You no longer see resources as something to chase desperately or protect anxiously. You see them as something entrusted to you to manage wisely. A struggler identity often carries hidden insecurity. It measures worth by outcomes, compares progress with others, and fears loss constantly. Emotional stability becomes fragile because security is tied to circumstances. When money increases, confidence rises. When money decreases, fear rises. This emotional cycle creates stress and inconsistency. Stewardship identity breaks this pattern. It anchors worth in purpose rather than possession. You begin to understand that your value is not measured by how much you have, but by how faithfully you manage what you have. Stewardship builds responsibility. Instead of blaming circumstances, systems, or people, you begin to evaluate your choices, habits, and discipline. Responsibility strengthens maturity. Mature thinking creates sustainable progress. You become proactive instead of reactive. Planning replaces panic. Vision replaces survival. Every decision becomes intentional rather than emotional. When identity shifts, habits change naturally. A struggler often operates impulsively, reacting to pressure, spending emotionally, delaying discipline, and avoiding long-term planning. A steward thinks strategically, values consistency, respects order, and invests wisely. These habits compound over time, creating stability and growth without unnecessary stress. Stewardship also strengthens confidence. Confidence grows not from ego, but from clarity and responsibility. When you know your role and purpose, confusion decreases. You trust your ability to manage challenges rather than fearing them. Confidence becomes calm rather than loud. Stewardship deepens patience. You recognize that growth takes time and consistency. You stop chasing shortcuts and quick fixes. You value sustainability more than speed. This patience protects long-term stability. Another powerful shift is emotional regulation. Strugglers often live with anxiety, fear, and emotional swings tied to circumstances. Stewards remain emotionally steady because their focus is long-term rather than reactive. Emotional stability strengthens decision quality and relational health. Stewardship improves discipline. You begin managing time, energy, finances, relationships, and priorities intentionally. Discipline creates freedom rather than restriction. Order creates clarity. Clarity creates peace. Peace strengthens productivity. When identity matures into stewardship, generosity becomes natural rather than forced. You see resources as circulating tools rather than personal trophies. Contribution increases satisfaction. Purpose strengthens motivation. Impact becomes meaningful. Stewardship also strengthens humility. You recognize that resources are entrusted rather than owned. Absolutely. Gratitude increases, pride decreases, dependence on God remains healthy and balanced. Humility keeps the heart teachable and flexible. Another powerful effect is vision. Strugglers focus on immediate needs. Stewards focus on future impact. Vision creates direction. Direction guides decisions. Vision strengthens endurance during slow seasons. Stewardship also strengthens resilience. Challenges become opportunities for growth rather than threats. Mistakes become lessons rather than shame. Resilience increases adaptability and confidence. Stewardship improves relationships. Responsible people earn trust. Trust creates influence. Influence creates opportunity. Healthy relationships multiply growth. Stewardship reshapes prayer. Instead of praying for survival, you pray for wisdom, clarity, discipline, impact, and alignment. Prayer becomes partnership rather than rescue. Stewardship strengthens gratitude. You appreciate progress, learning, stability, and growth rather than only large breakthroughs. Gratitude protects peace and joy. Stewardship reduces comparison. When you understand your assignment, you stop measuring yourself against others. Contentment increases. Focus sharpens. Stewardship builds legacy thinking. You consider how today's decisions affect future stability, family, community, and impact. Legacy creates responsibility beyond personal comfort. Stewardship strengthens self-respect. You value your ability to manage, build, and contribute meaningfully. Confidence deepens. Stewardship also increases spiritual sensitivity. Responsibility sharpens discernment. You become attentive to dance because your choices matter. Stewardship strengthens consistency. Consistency builds momentum. Momentum compounds growth. Stewardship protects against waste. You become mindful of how you use resources, time, and energy. Waste decreases. Efficiency increases. Stewardship deepens peace. When life is ordered, stress decreases. When priorities are aligned, clarity increases. When discipline is consistent, stability strengthens. Stewardship also protects against entitlement. Gratitude replaces expectation. Responsibility replaces complaint. Stewardship creates alignment between character and capacity. Character matures before expansion. Expansion becomes sustainable rather than chaotic. When identity shifts from struggler to steward, abundance becomes sustainable rather than temporary. Stability becomes normal rather than rare. Growth becomes intentional rather than accidental. You stop chasing money and start managing purpose. You stop fearing loss and start building wisely. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding strategically. You stop surviving and start leading your life with clarity and confidence. Ultimately, identity shift sustains long-term abundance because mindset governs behavior, behavior shapes habits, habits determine outcomes, and outcomes reinforce identity. When identity aligns with stewardship, abundance flows with responsibility, peace, stability, and impact rather than pressure and fear.